Hi everyone, welcome back to another Dungeons & Dragons video. I'm Nick, Director of Operations, and today we're going to take you to the next steps to start training you up to the official version of Dungeons & Dragons. Now, today we're going to be talking about modifiers, and I'm sure you're asking me, well, what exactly are modifiers? Well, if you've ever seen a cutscene or a movie where you see a bunch of people sitting around the table rolling dice and adding a bunch of numbers up, well, those numbers are modifiers because they modify your roll. You roll a d20 and then you add something to it. This adds an exciting layer to the game because it makes it a little bit more reliable whether you succeed or fail at a roll. In our last video, we mainly depended on straight rolls, just rolling the die and taking the number from that roll. Now we get to make things a little bit more reliable, and we get to reflect your character's strengths and weaknesses into the rolls, which makes it a little bit better for storytelling. So let's jump into exactly what modifiers are for Dungeons & Dragons. Before we get to the actual modifiers, we need to talk about ability scores. These ability scores describe your 6 basic attributes: strength, dexterity, forgot the other one for a second there, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, I don't know why it's taking me a minute to think about that, and charisma. So all of those attributes describe different things. Strength is pretty straightforward. It represents how physically strong your character is. It can also depend on how hard you hit. So if you're wielding something like a giant axe, for example, that would definitely come into play when you make an attack roll. It could be how easily you pick up, say, a boulder, or pick up a companion to throw them, as you say may toss a dwarf. Dexterity measures your quickness and balance. So this is when you are using, say, trying to walk a tightrope, or if you are attempting to pick a lock, or maybe you're using a weapon that has a little bit more finesse, such as a short sword, a dagger, or a ranged weapon such as a longbow. Constitution is your overall health and resistance. So when you are saying trying to resist or shrug off some sort of disease, then you would depend on your constitution to try and help pull you through. Intelligence is your ability to calculate, your studies, your broad experience of knowledge. Maybe you're a wizard and you're attempting to cast a spell, or you're trying to recall a piece of lore or knowledge about a long forgotten race that maybe you did some research on. Wisdom basically represents your perception and intuition. So for example, this might be a ranger attempting to see and decipher something off in the distance, or it could be something more spiritual and the cleric attempting to commune with his or her god to determine the best path forward, relying on something more spiritual. Charisma. Charisma basically represents your ability to interact with other people. Perhaps you're trying to broker with a merchant. This could even be something as subtle as, say, trying to find someone to talk to find the best gossip and news in town. Really depends on how you want to use it. So I've gone ahead and described these traits, but now we need to assign numbers to them. So how do we do that? I think it would be easiest to see this applied to a specific character. And let's go with a very common example of character. Let's go ahead and make a barbarian. They're fun to play, really simple, and they can smash and do all the typical things that most people want to do, which is, hit things and then take the gold. All right, so we have our 6 basic ability scores or traits, and I'll put them on screen somewhere around here. So there are 2 general ways that we can generate these numbers. The first one being using a pre-generated set of numbers, which are, and I'm actually looking at my sheet here because I'm not going to remember, 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8. So you have all these numbers and you can put them wherever you want. Because I'm playing a barbarian, I want to make sure that I have good scores in strength, dexterity, and constitution. I could potentially put some in the mental categories, but because my guy is going to be a very frontline fighter, those are going to be my focuses. So I'm going to take the 15, I'm going to put that in strength, I'm going to take the 14, put that in the constitution, and I'll take the 13 and put that in dexterity. The rest of the numbers I can kind of mix around a little bit, but because I'm a barbarian, I need to perceive things a little bit and rely a little bit more on intuition. I'm going to put the 12 in my wisdom. The charisma I will put at 10. The intelligence I don't need so much, so I'm going to put that at 8. Keep in mind that as we go through this, you can play a different sort of barbarian. Maybe your barbarian isn't particularly strong. Maybe he's actually very wise and he has some high constitution. That could be an interesting and fun character to play. It's totally up to you. Now, method number 2 for generating these numbers is to actually roll dice. So what you're going to do is grab 4 6-sided dice. And the way that we refer to these in Dungeons & Dragons and a lot of other common role-playing games is 4d6. So 4 6-sided dice. This can apply to anything from, say, 2d4 or 2 4-sided dice, or say something ridiculous like 10d12, which is 10 12-sided dice. By the way, if the Dungeon Master ever rolls that many dice, oh boy, just be prepared. Now, going back to our original example, you grab 4d6 dice, again, 4 6-sided dice, you roll them, and you add up the 3 highest numbers, and that will generate your stats. You're going to do this 6 times, and then you will have a set of 6 numbers that, again, you can rearrange however you want. So this is actually my preferred method of rolling up stats for characters because it's a little bit more random. You don't always get to pick what you want, so you have to make decisions on what kind of character you're going to make. And this can also lead to more interesting role-playing. Some people like to actually use their stats to determine what their character will do. This is totally optional for you, but that's just my 2 cents on the matter. So choose whichever method you need. Really quickly, there is a third method, but it involves a point system, and I figure at this stage it's probably a little too complicated to worry about. But essentially, you spend points to buy higher stats. I think this is totally fine with just the 2 options, but just know there's a third option out there, and you can actually look it up online. Now, before we move on to the actual modifier, let me just get a couple thoughts in. So don't despair if you have a low number in a stat. That's okay. Remember that doesn't mean that you're going to fail something each and every time. This is what the D20 roll is for. You don't know necessarily if you're going to fail or succeed. It just means that it may be a little bit more likely for you to succeed, or it may be a little less sure. You never know. This is what adds a level of excitement to the game. And it doesn't mean that you can't try something. Just because you have a low stat in something doesn't mean you can't try it. Every character can try to pick up a boulder. Every character can try to read script of like some sort of unknown language. Just with your stats, it may mean that you have a higher chance of succeeding, or you may have a little bit of a tougher time, but you can still roll very high and still succeed. So I definitely encourage you guys to keep trying everything. Plus, there's nothing better than having, say, with my barbarian character, if he rolls a natural 20 on trying to decipher this ancient elven script and being able to read it perfectly. That's just hilarious. In fact, most of these ability scores are going to be up to the DM to decide what role you should make. For example, the barbarian could request to use his big size to force his way through a crowd, which he may actually have him either use his strength to physically move them, or he may ask them to use his charisma and general effect on people to ask them to move. Really depends on 1, what the players ask for, and 2, how the DM wants them to use what they've requested in this particular situation, and he will call upon the specific attribute to use. Now, onto the modifier. Once you know what the ability score is, we need to determine what the modifier is. You have an overall ability score, and then we generate a modifier which will later augment your roll. In order to do this, we need to do a little bit of math. The way you determine your modifier is pretty simple. First, subtract 10 from your overall ability score, then divide by 2, rounding down. So going back to our example, I have a strength of 15, according to what I gave to my barbarian. So I'm going to subtract 10, which leaves me with 5. I'm going to divide by 2, which gives me 2.5, and I'm going to round down to the next lowest whole number, which is 2. This means that I have a +2 to any strength-based score or attack that I am making. So, for example, if I am attempting to pick up a boulder, I would roll a d20 and then add +2 for my strength. Versus if I am saying, for example, wielding a great sword, I would then roll a d20, again add +2 to see if I hit, and we'll see what happens. However, you can also have a negative modifier. Remember that intelligence score that I maybe put 8 into? Well, let's do the math again. We're going to subtract 10, which gives me -2. We're going to divide by 2, which gives me a -1. No rounding needed here. So whenever I make an intelligence-based score, I then roll the d20 and subtract 1. So for example, if I am, on the very unlikely chance, trying to cast a spell, which barbarians can't really do that, but let's roll with it, then I will roll the d20, subtract 1, and we'll see what happens. But don't be discouraged. Remember, you can still roll very high, so even if you have a negative modifier, there's still a chance you may succeed. So definitely try anything that comes to mind or something you want to try. Overall, modifiers help make the game way more exciting. they add a level of reliability that make it more likely for you to complete tougher challenges. Additionally, it gives you a chance to incorporate your character's strengths or weaknesses to the overall story and see what shenanigans happen. However, it also enforces you to work as a team. That barbarian could perhaps maybe benefit from having a rogue in the party who's a little bit more dexterous, maybe attacks from a range using his dex, or maybe up close using a finesse weapon like a dagger. Or he could perhaps benefit from a wizard who's much more knowledgeable in the arcane arts and maybe can cast some spells to help support his bashing up in the front. Now, some quick notes for the Dungeon Masters. Per the main rules, characters cannot naturally max out their stats above 20, meaning they can have a maximum of +5 to any of their modifiers. However, note this does not mean that you can't get a magic item that boosts your abilities above that. Say a magic item increases your strength to 23, which gives you a +6. Or perhaps you have a magic headband that maybe increases your wisdom by a little bit. However, there may also be some items that decrease it. Those are the cursed items, watch out for those. Additionally, it's also possible for characters to increase their stats naturally. Every 4th level, characters can choose to spend 2 additional points, either in one stat, so if that 15 I had earlier, I can add 2 to it to get up to a max of 17, which would give me a +3 in my strength, or I can spend 1 point on any 2 attributes I choose. So I could put 1 into strength, still get the +3, and then maybe I'll think about putting it in, no, I'm not going to put it in intelligence. I'll put it into something else. Like say, maybe I'll boost my constitution or maybe just make my wisdom a little bit higher. Really depends on what I'm going for. Also, some additional things to keep in mind. Monsters and enemies get modifiers too. Depending on the type of monster, they will both have strengths and weaknesses. Just like my barbarian, he's not so good in the mental department. Some creatures may have better strength and worse intelligence, or vice versa. They might be very charismatic and maybe they're not so good with the dexterity and whatnot. Try to determine what you think would be fair for the adventurers to face. If it's one monster versus the whole group, then maybe think about increasing the stats a little bit to help compensate. Keep in mind that our current scale of successful hit, or the difficulty check, we have a scale of 2 to 19. So really reserve those +5 stats, or if you have more than that, for the really tough monsters. However, if you want to have a really strong monster in one particular stat, that's totally fine. There are other ways you can balance it out. You can make the monster slower, either physically, so it takes longer for it to actually reach an adventurer, or you can have it take fewer actions on its turn. You can also make it easier to hit by lowering its AC, which is a very specific difficulty class. You can change how many hits it takes before it goes unconscious. You can make some stats high and lower the others. You can also give it a reduced attack range. If you give the monster special abilities, you can also have it so the ability has to recharge. A great example of this is the actual dragons in Dungeons and Dragons cannot constantly use their breath weapons. They have to roll a d6, which is a 6-sided die, and on a 5 or 6, the weapon recharges. So this is a good way to make sure that you're not just constantly using the strongest ability that it has. You can even include things in the actual dungeon or map that will give the adventurers a chance to hide behind things or take cover, therefore maybe increasing their AC a little bit or making them harder to hit. Admittedly, making a balanced creature for an encounter can be pretty tough. However, for our modified version of D&D, I've gone ahead and put this chart somewhere on the screen together to help you when you're designing your monster. Remember, this is going to take some practice because while this is going to guide you with the modifiers, you're going to have to balance that with all the other features that you add to your monster or creature. However, this is D&D. If you make something super overpowered or you miscalculate something, that's okay. You can improv. For example, maybe there's a reason the monster has to flee. Maybe there is a group of soldiers that suddenly come in. What do you want, Google? I did not ask you. Getting back on track. So maybe there's a reason the monster has to flee. Maybe a group of soldiers come by and scare the monster off, and then the adventurers will have to come back a little bit later when they're a tad bit stronger to try and take it down. So don't be afraid to get a little creative with some solutions if it turns out you maybe miscalculated just a little bit. This happens to everybody. So that's going to wrap up our talk about modifiers. Hope you enjoyed it, and as time goes on, I'm going to continue to introduce other facets of Dungeons and Dragons, so that way, again, we build you up to the full rule set, and hopefully it'll be a good time. If you have any questions about this modified version of D&D that I'm sort of cobbling together here, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Yes, comments, that's what it's called. Leave a question in the comments below. Consider subscribing if you like the content we're putting out. Consider maybe liking it. That would be nice. However, make sure you check out our other content, and if you, again, haven't seen the previous video, definitely make sure you watch that first because, well, you're at the end of the video, so it doesn't matter. Maybe I'll put that at the beginning. Also consider checking out our other content. We put out daily projects that the DAE team is working on to kind of just encourage people to try stuff out, follow along, and maybe you'll learn a little bit. And of course, we always do lessons related to the digital arts, so I definitely encourage you to check out our main website, which is the dae.com. You can check out all that info in the video description below. So thank you again for swinging by, and hopefully I'll see you for another video on Dungeons and Dragons. I'll see you later.